Okay, my name is Scott Johnson. This is a Bio 168 Human Anatomy and Physiology, part one of the first chapter. This chapter has 5 different parts. Don't freak out about that. I try and keep them in bite-sized pieces for you guys. And this is a human anatomy and physiology course, so that affords us the opportunity to not have to dive into differences in other vertebrate organ systems. Even though we might use vertebrates in the lab, it's really just to highlight human anatomical structures and not to really highlight the differences that exist. So for this first chapter, the first thing that we're going to cover is really what is anatomy and what is physiology, and then how we can break those down. So I just want to make sure that everyone is familiar with this. So anatomy is going to be the study. I apologize for my handwriting. It is really hard to write on the screen. It's the study of the structure. Now, when we're taking a look at these structures, they can either be very large, so gross anatomy. It can also be called macroscopic. Most people will refer to it as just gross anatomy. Or if we want to take a look at cells and tissues, or if anything is wrong, it's certain type of pathology, then we would do microscopic anatomy. We also have another branch, developmental. I do have slides dedicated to all 3 of these, although with the developmental, I'm really only going to mention it here. This is more just to introduce the idea that in certain spots throughout 168, 169, you may talk about how something arose. We do that maybe with the brain. We do that with the kidney. The kidney has interlobular arteries. Why do they have them? Why is there cortical tissue deep inside? And we'll go over how they arose so that you understand why the terminology and why the tissues exist the way that they do. But not something that I'm really going to go back over much. All right. Then we have physiology. Physiology is the study. I am going to try and write as little as possible. Study of the function. Okay. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over each of these in the next few slides. But really what I want to do first is I want to talk about why is there this marriage between anatomy and physiology. Your first class typically that you take is going to be anatomy and physiology. It was later on in my academic career that I took a gross anatomy class or I took a systems phys class. Your first introduction, though, is both of them. And why is that? Well, one of the most fundamental principles of all of anatomy and physiology is this principle of complementarity. And all that principle of complementarity says is that there is a relationship between structure and function, or function and structure. And so if we know what structure a particular organ has, we can start to make some estimates as to what it does. Vice versa. If we know what a particular organ or structure does, we can start to make some estimates as to what structure it has to have or it should have. The one thing that I want to stress here is that in my notes right here, I say function always reflects structure. I just want you to know principle of complementarity is just basically that there is a relationship between these two. So if I put on a true or false exam, principle of complementarity says that there's a relationship between structure and function. It's not a trick question. Okay, don't worry about the order if function is first or structure. There is a relationship between those two. We're going to go over this again and again and again throughout the semester, probably more so in 169, but that's also more because we cover more organ systems in 169. But I will be going over this, like I said, again and again and again. And typically the way that I set up my classes is that for the class, I have no idea why it does that. For the class, we are going to focus on the function. And then for the lab, we're going to focus on the structure. So class is going to be more physiology, lab is going to be more anatomy, basically. There will be some crossover because of this principle of complementarity, but that's pretty much what my focus is. Now, if you remember, we said anatomy, I broke it down into gross, microscopic, and developmental. So we're just going to take a quick look at each of those again. So with gross anatomy, you can also break down your gross anatomy into regional. You can say, all right, we're going to be taking a look at everything that we can see with the naked eye, but what we're going to do is for regional gross anatomy, we're going to take a look at the leg, and we're going to identify all the blood vessels, muscles, nerves, bone, lymphatics, everything in one particular region. And most gross anatomy classes, if that's the class that you're taking, are set up that way. There's also systemic. So with systemic, what you're going to do is you're going to cover cardiovascular first, skeletal, muscular, so on and so forth. Our labs, our courses are set up systemically, okay, that we're going to do this in a systemic fashion. There's a third one, surface, a study of internal structures as they relate to the overlying skin. I'm really not too worried about that. We really won't even be talking about that again. So that was gross anatomy. Microscopic anatomy, we have two subdivisions. Cytology. Cytology is the study of cells. And then histology is the study of tissues. So those two will fall under microscopic anatomy. Next is developmental anatomy. So again, I kind of already talked about this. I'm not too worried about it. I would just know what developmental anatomy is and why it's there. We also have some specialized branches of anatomy, and those are going to be pathological anatomy. We'll take a look at what happens to these structural changes, and once we know the principle of complementarity of structure and function, if we know that there are structural changes, then we'll be able to identify what functional changes that will result. And these are changes that are caused by disease. Our focus is not going to be on pathology. If you take a look at everything that we have to cover a lot. Here and there, when I can, I will mention certain pathologies, and I'll just try and hit on some of the major ones and some of the most common pathologies that you will see regardless of what type of field you are going into. Next is molecular biology. And this is really, I have to be honest, I was really just trying to fit molecular biology somewhere. And this is more just to kind of identify, through my graduate career, I did a lot of molecular biology and I did a lot of physiology, but they were separate. Now what you're starting to see is that there is this huge integration. People in the medical field need to understand PCR, microarrays, DNA chips, just genes, and be able to understand that because of pharmacogenomics, treatments. All of these things now have changed so much that people in the medical fields really have to have a basic understanding of this molecular biology. Okay, now what I want to end this recording with is just kind of putting what we're going to be covering in 168 and 169 into some sort of conceptual framework, and then give you an idea of the relationship. I mean, in the previous slide, we talked about cells and we talked about tissues. Kind of want to fit this all into what we call a hierarchical organization or a structural organization. So the first level that we have is what's called a chemical level. And in this chemical level, we have atoms and we have molecules. Right? So atoms is the smallest. Atoms will join to form molecules. Different types of molecules will be able to form cells. Okay? And for right now, I will get into autonomous and differentiation a little bit later. So I wouldn't worry too much about this image right here. I'd really just rather focus on atoms, molecules, cells. Every living thing has to at least be made up of one cell, and these cells are constructed in part from these molecules. And the study of cells we already identified as cytology. Now, different cells will be organized into tissues. Again, I was kind of ambitious with what I wanted to cover. I wouldn't worry about the organization of tissues. Right now, I just want you to know what the 4 types of tissues are. So similar cells that have a common function are tissues, and we have 4 types in humans. We have epithelial tissue, CT or connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissue. All right, and then we can have different tissues that will help form an organ. Another example, here's the intestine. Another example that I'd like to cover is a blood vessel. A lot of people don't realize that a blood vessel is an organ. It is, because it is made up of different types of tissue. We're going to have some ET, simple squamous epithelium. We're going to have some CT that is deep to it, depending on the blood vessel. We're also going to have some muscle. Wow, that is really bad handwriting. We are going to have some muscle, and then we're going to have some sort of innervation. So organ, and then we have organ systems. Okay, organ systems, cardiovascular system, reproductive system, integumentary system, so on and so forth. So if we take a look at this, this kind of serves as our roadmap. So chapter 1 is really just about anatomy, language, those sorts of things. We are going to be taking a look at this, molecules and atoms, in chapter 2. Cells is going to be the very next chapter. After that, we go into tissues. And then after that, it's just organ system after organ system. My next part 2 of this recording, what we do is I just quickly, very, very quickly, and briefly just go over all of the different organ systems. Really what I want to do is just make sure that we're all starting off at the same starting point. And that is the end of this recording.